mic. It's a bit of a crutch. Yes, welcome, welcome. And it's great to see such a huge crowd. And you picked a good lecture to attend, because I know we're in for a treat. Georgianne was right when I said, pick me, please let me curate. I had no idea there were going to be 4 galleries put together. But I wish Anne was here, Anne Feldschuh. Because truly, and guys, I assure you, this is not false modesty in any way. I could not do this. I could not do it without Anne, who is... I have the photograph to prove it. Later I'll show everybody. And virtually everyone on the staff is just amazing colleagues that jump in at the last minute. And yes, Johnny come lately, come running through the door, as always, my hair wet, but we were preparing right up until the last moment. And this show was really, it was so much fun to put together, and Charlotte and Mernet were so gracious to work with. People ask me sometimes, where do the ideas come from? Are you charged with presenting a certain number of media per year? So I am very blessed in that I'm given a lot of freedom from Georgianne and the board to design the exhibition program. But as you know, we always try to have sort of somewhat related exhibits, and always give an opportunity for the community to participate. So although our new gallery, we have featured our faculty, the heart of the Art Center, they as should be, and they were promised that first exhibit in the gallery. The other shows are related to word, text, poetry, and this particular exhibit sprang from the title of a book by Gaston Bachelard, who was born in the late 1800s, and I believe he wrote this book the year before I was born. I was introduced, it was 1958, and I learned of it about 30 years at this point, 25 years ago. Introduced to me by a bad boyfriend, but he was a lot of fun and had a lot of good ideas. Rich in the mind, but he was lacking in other ways. But I'll be ever grateful to him for that. But there were a lot of synchronicities that surfaced when putting together this show, and anyone who is familiar with the nonprofit world, we're constantly asked to project, as any good organization should, what is our calendar, what are we doing over the next 2 years. Well, and then when the grants are coming up, you have to sit and compose it all, whether it comes to pass or not. But this was, the concept was hatched a long time ago. So, sometimes the ideas you come up with fall off, but this was one that fortunately took, and Mernet and Charlotte were just absolute dreams for inviting to this show. And as it turned out, when I spoke to Charlotte, she Mernet was your mentor. I did not know, and she draws greatly upon this particular text, which was introduced to her by Mernet. And another artist who I stumbled upon and inviting, turns out everybody knows in Brooklyn, and Mernet had actually curated her in a show that she put together. I found her on the Instagram. So there are a lot of interesting synchronicities, you could say. And then I'm very, very grateful to the Lerner family, Jill and her daughter Natalie for sharing the monumental paintings in the back of Leslie Lerner, who passed away 10 years ago. One thing that all Charlotte, Leslie, Mernet, Charlotte, and Leslie have in common are they were all educators. Oh, how wonderful! Charlotte teaches at the Parsons School presently. Mernet is Professor Emeritus, USF, having taught there for 35 years and receiving the highest honor. I brought my cheat sheet in introducing everybody because these guys have so many honors. There was no way I could remember. So without further ado, they are going to be able to articulate so much more articulately their connection to this theme. And who would like to go first? Okay. Well.
Actually, Charlotte will go first. But out of curiosity, I just wondered how many of you have actually read Bouchard's book, Poetics of Space. That's hard. So we thought we will not make any effort to connect what we talk about to the book. And instead we will try to connect what we talk about to the concept Poetics of Space as much as possible. So we tossed a coin and Charlotte was going to talk first.
Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to the show and having me down. I've had two main interests as an artist, space and narrative. And in terms of narrative, I've been very interested in drawing upon large historical events, particularly disturbing ones, and how they affect both me personally, but also sort of our collective landscape. And I think of my images as psychological landscapes, and kind of circling back around Bashar and the Poetics of Space. You know, he talks about how the image is itself, but it's also always something more, that it's imbued with something that goes beyond itself, or takes you beyond just that image itself. And that's been something that's very important to me in my own work. I mean, one of his quotes is, "All great, simple images reveal a psychic state." And I think about also moving out to space. Around 2005, I started bending and folding the paper. I was thinking about what paper could do, bending and folding it. And I've always been very interested in illusionistic spaces and taking these various multiple vignettes and weaving them together into a more sort of otherworldly or abstract space. I think of those bends and folds as something that's happening to the paper, just like events and things in the world happen to us. So this idea that what happens in the world also happens to us. And I try to embody that both in the rendering of the images as well as the bends and folds of the paper. Right now I've been crumpling the paper, so I have some of those drawings. There wasn't room for them, but you can go on my website and see some of the more crumpled drawings. And the last thing I'm going to talk about that kind of segues in with Mernet's work, something that we both share, which is is a chapter from the Poetics of Space called Intimate Immensity. And he talks about how those qualities really enhance each other. And I was very taken with this phrase in graduate school and began thinking about scale and how I would take really small miniature forms and play that with these large, expansive spaces. And so I was very drawn to this notion of the miniature and how the miniature is kind of tied to the domestic, and also it takes us out of this particular time and place. It kind of puts it in this other time. And that's another thing that's been very important to me, is that even though my drawings have gotten larger over time, the proportions or scale of the images doesn't change too much. I don't want them to be too large so that they come into our space or participate with our real world. I want them to be definitely spaces and images that you go into, like with your mind. So that's been, an important aspect of my work. There's more I can talk about, but I'm going to have Mernet take over. And then,
We thought that we would talk for a while and then open things up.
yeah.
But if it doesn't open up and nobody has anything to say, we'll talk to each other. As it turns out, most of the paintings in this show of mine have reverse perspective. Reverse perspective isn't something that I always use or even usually use, but it just happens that most of them in this show have it. So I thought I would concentrate on that as a way of talking about space. I've been interested in, for maybe 40 years, trying to find ways to deal with space so that you're not a spectator. You as a viewer are not a spectator. How can you sort of be absorbed into the painting rather than standing outside of it looking as if you're looking in a window or looking at something on a stage? So one of the ways I've dealt with that in the past decades is often to use parallel perspective, as Japanese artists did, and as architects often do, because it suggests depth, but it doesn't locate you in that space. You don't know where you are. You're not standing out here. You just know there is depth, and you can sort of go through that. So the one in the middle, which is the only one without reverse perspective here, this landscape, was based on a Japanese composition, which I turned upside down, so it was just abstract shapes and lines. But I really liked the shapes and lines and the space. So I tried to interpret it as something that I could relate to in my life. So what probably was a wall, and then I don't even know what it was originally, so it doesn't matter. But I began to see those sort of tan things as being like the brick buildings, that pale brick USF. And then all that labyrinth of sidewalks around USF, and the sort of open green areas, and the big oak trees there. And there was a little shape in my source up there where the yellow bus is. And it seemed really interesting and really important, and I didn't know what to make there. So I decided to turn this black shape into a road and have that be a bus. Then it seemed like when I got to the other side of the building, I wanted it to be a very different kind of space. Like you go around behind the building, and this is what you expected behind the building. So that turned into sort of a river, like Hillsborough River or something, with these boats, which are kind of, I guess, Japanese boats or something, I don't know. But it seemed like they needed some sort of canopy over them. So the subject matter in that one sort of evolved out of the composition that I wanted to deal with. Now, to shift to the one next to it, for many, many years I thought I wanted to do a painting faculty meeting. But I spent half of my life in faculty meetings, it seemed like. And I have a certain fondness for faculty meetings. So it seemed like someone should commemorate them. But I never could figure out a way to do it because it's sort of intrinsically boring to anyone who's not there. Maybe a lot of people are there. But so when you just do it so evolutionistically, it's just boring. So I was thinking of so I couldn't find any way to do that. And then there's the other problem: if you have a bunch of people around a table, how do you not make it as if they're all posing for a photograph? Or how do you make it so the figures in the front don't block out the figures in the back? So So after a few years of this sort of back in my mind, I came up with this idea of, well, what if the viewer were the vanishing point? What if the viewer were the thing that usually disappears, this infinitely small thing? The viewer were that point. And then everything grew out away from the viewer. So you as an infinitely small person would be way down there about a foot below the canvas. And then as you look at the room, the figures grow as they move away from you, and the floor and the tables all grow as they move away from you. So the furthest away ones are the largest. And you then are put in this position of sort of being pulled through and into it without having any clear location. So you can sort of know it or wear it or something, but you can't sort of stand out here as an isolated, detached viewer. So, and then I couldn't think of people who had done reverse perspective. So I just became intrigued with what would happen if you did reverse perspective. So I took these photographs of faculty meetings and I turned the photographs upside down so the tables were upside down. And then I located their, you know anything about perspective, you know, parallel lines converge to a vanishing point. So I found that vanishing point, and then I more or less located the people. And I used the actual people that were there. Now I changed figures in terms of their size. It would have been really boring if they'd been sort of squat and mathematically correct. So anyway, then I ended up doing a bunch of those. I did about 6 or 7 faculty meeting paintings in reverse perspective. So after that, I decided to see what would happen if I tried landscapes in reverse perspective. So this painting and that painting are, well, the one over here, can you see it okay? Where you are? I was looking for a landscape that didn't have too many things blocking off things in the foreground. So I found these things online in Masada, I think, in the Middle East, Palestine area. And found this one of a bus and some people, some tourists standing around. So I just turned the photograph upside down so the road was inverted. And then the bus didn't look right. When I put the bus back in, I couldn't get it to look right. It seemed to be tilting. So I thought, well, I kind of like it, but why would it tilt like that? And I thought, well, if one of the tires came off, it would tilt. So I took the tire and I put it on the highway next to it. And then, so then the tourists, which were in the photograph that I used, then are in reverse perspective are larger in the distance, and they're out, of course, they have to get out because they're fixing the tires, so they're out there with their cameras. And then the left-hand corner didn't work very well, so I ended up, and I could put more tourists up there, so it would be redundant. So I came up with this idea of this arrow. And then, lo and behold, I did this painting about 5 years ago, but a couple years ago on the internet, I saw this movie, some of you probably saw it, with Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, which is sort of that situation. You know, these Arab boys, you know the movie? I didn't see the whole thing, I just saw part of it. These little Arab boys come out and they shoot a gun, and they aim it at this tourist bus going by, and the tourist bus, and it actually hits it. So Angelina Jolie's character is shot, and the bus comes to a halt, and the boys run away. I mean, it was sort of so weird. And then, so this one was another one that was based on a sand painting where I tried the same thing to try reversing and converting that. And anyway, I think that's enough for us to open that one. So does anybody have any questions or issues they'd like to bring up about either one of our work?
I'd like to know from Charlotte how she generates her narrative. Do you have a narrative that you illustrate, or does the narrative get constructed as you draw?
Yeah, up until recently, I would say the idea is like a seed idea growing out of either things that I'm reading or things that are happening. And so I start with that, but in some ways it just takes off and grows. something more specifically, taking clues from Mernet. So this drawing here was made, I think, around 2007 or 8. And it's actually an image of a flight simulator and that curved wall of the landscape. It's very kind of coded, you can't see. And I was in Brooklyn at 9/11, and so it almost kind of grabbed me by the collar and put me into history, where I never felt really participating in history. This event put me in history, and it just almost kind of came up in my work. And so there's residues of that, and you see these dark, billowing clouds came up. There's also things that I put in that are rather personal. There's an image sort of a bed that kind of has this pond with rocks and kind of this figure that's laid on a cot. At the time, my father had passed away, and so it was about kind of seeing him laid out and thinking about that. There's a small missile with the top lopped off, and there's a teacup and biscuits. So I'm thinking about the notion of hospitality between nations, and kind of, sometimes they become a little bit like prayers or wishes to lop off the top of a missile and put a cup and some biscuits for hospitality and talk and communion. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about in the imagery. There's a lot more. Yeah, Dennis.
How in the world do you manipulate the paper and do those charcoal drawings? Which comes first? Could you explain a little bit about the technique?
Yeah, I start with a fine charcoal line drawing, and then I take compressed charcoal, alpha color charcoal brand, and I basically rub it in with my finger, and I erase out. So it's an additive subtractive process. That's how we get these really refined lights and darks.
And then you manipulate the paper after that?
I typically manipulate the paper before. I want to know what the sculptural, I'm interested in how that sculptural spaces play with the illusionistic spaces.
Do you flatten it out and then rebend it, or do you actually work on the surfaces you have?
A little bit of both. I kind of keep them the way they are as much as possible. There's at times when I'm pushing into the paper I have to flatten it out. But yeah.
It's so pristine, though. I can't imagine having worked with charcoal, how it does the
I have extremely dry hands. That's part of it, and I just work kind of from a center and out. And I get my hands, it rubs, but you can easily put it back. I pick paper that accepts the charcoal really well, but also releases it. So I can actually move things around, to a fair amount.
Can I ask you something? This does relate to the book. But one of the things that Schulz talks about is the concept of the actuality of the house. And then he talks about the house from the cellar to the attic, and what significance, there's various questions of significance that people attach through all cultures to cellars, and then through the different layers of the house, and then to the attic. And when the first work that I knew of yours when you were a student was that you did houses. But they were just basically houses from the outside usually. And then you started to go inside the houses. And then by the time you're getting to these, it seems like there's lots of layers of height. Like you're down under, and then you're going to another level and another level. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you feel that sort of expansion of the kind of house closeness as it sort of becomes exploded or layered, or how would you think about it?
Well, I think, with the house image, I mean, national art talks about the house as the intimate topography of our being. And the house is this long metaphor for being a metaphor for the self, or the psyche, and those different layers. So I was investigating almost in this very classic psychoanalytic process of moving closer and closer to the house, and it opening up. And then at a certain point, it was no longer made sense to have inside, outside, these strict boundaries. It was like the more sense of knowing yourself or being more comfortable in the world, you could allow the world to come in. And I think that's what happened. The world came in, and it just became this kind of no boundary flow between inside and outside.
Which is another chapter in inside and outside.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I can't tell you the honor it is. This is the first time Mernet and I have been in a show together. We have had such a strong, teacher-student relationship, and now we're very good friends. And I owe everything to Mernet. And so it's really a special moment for me to have this. I think one thing that's interesting, in terms of, and our work is on opposite, is that, Mernet, I would just be curious if you would talk about, well, they're funny, right? They're very funny, and there's some really funny elements. I have sort of funny elements, not that. But I would love for you to talk about the sense of time in your work.
Okay, yeah, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, because I wanted Charlotte also to talk about weather in her painting at night. Because in a way, my paintings and her paintings are opposite in that respect, and that hers are just filled with weather and foreboding and light splashing across things, and the sense of time, movement in time, while mine are very still and in a way very weatherless and lightless. I'm sort of want them to be kind of analogies for the world, the structure of the world. And so I deliberately do not have shadows, hardly ever, and keep the colors very local colors, the colors like early Renaissance painters did, where there was very little light in Piero della Francesca, for example, or Sensetta, or some of those. They were very, those are the painters I really love. So I like that sense of timelessness, stepping out of time to a kind of eternal sense of something transcending time. And yours, on the other hand, seem just opposite of that. Things that seem immersed in time and swamped almost by time.
Yeah, I think so. I like this notion of being like in between sort of time. It's either here or there. It's either in the present or the future or something. And that, I think that miniature, I think that frame with scale, I think for both of our works, sort of enhances that or brings that out. I'm not sure. What do you
I've known your work for a while, but this is the first time I've gotten to see the original. And I love your work. I especially respond to the muted palette. But whenever I've seen your work, it's been glossy because it's printed on glossy paper. So now I'm intrigued as to how and why you use a muted or a matte surface.
Oh, well, these are acrylic paintings, but I always hated the plastic feeling that acrylic has. So for one thing, I want them to be kind of matte and muted, and I want the surfaces to change a lot. And so when I start, I use, I staple the canvas to the wall, and I put lots of layers and I add spackling compound or sheetrock compound to the paint, so that right away tends to suck the moisture out of the paint to make it matte. And then I also add a lot of times, like in the one on the far left, I have a lot of sheetrock compound. I use that a lot anyway. But I also do, as you get close to these, you'll see that almost all of them have a lot of tracing paper glued onto them. Because I do that as a working method for one thing. When I'm trying out things in a painting, I will try it in paint it on a piece of tracing paper, cut it out, get it wet, put it up there. Maybe I'll have 10 heads or 10 eyes or something like that, you know. And I'll try them on, like trying on clothes or something. Because I'm very indecisive, so I need this method that allows me to try a lot of things and then not have to commit. So, but then when I get one right, I glue it on. So, and I really like that, when that happens, because the surface, the tracing paper with the acrylic on, I like much better than the acrylic surface. So between those two things, and I do other things too, like for example, with all of the ones with faculty meetings that have these linoleum floors, I actually made these tiles out of paper rhomboids and made them like I suppose they probably made those tiles with these, you know, squeegee paint across it, and I added like a shiny medium to it, to the paint, to the thick paint, and cut them out and interlock them. It takes a long time, but I like the kind of because everything is so cold in a way. I like something to be very real feeling, and so usually the things I have to be real feeling in that very literal sense are things that are kind of not the figures or something else in the painting.
We were talking about the concept of time. I love that you both have that in the work, and you were saying out of time, that perhaps the content of the subject is out of time, and yet it's fascinating the labor intensity of your work. I mean, the process that you, the layers and layers and cutting and pasting and painting. Is there any correlation? I mean, do you ever look at that sort of theme and versus the doing? I mean, is there any connection? It's a strange question. Maybe it's just that it's kind of interesting to hear you talk about the process.
Yeah.
And then the
Well, they
painting
just can't
stands
stay
still.
out forever, so I guess it's
Don't be
drawings. But you're doing and so am I, so it's hard to say, but I mean, they're both labor intensive.
Yeah.
In different ways, very different ways.
Fresh, I mean, I think most artists would say that they hope in the end that the work looks like it just poof into existence, kind of magically. That's the little secret, but that it didn't show it. Yeah, I mean, I'm always amazed with Mernet's, she will, I think what I really respect and admire about Mernet's process and method is the deep thoughtfulness and analysis of, like this painting here, the woman with the outstretched arm and the man looking down, just the sense of just perfect rightness about the placement of those forms, and then sort of emotionally, psychologically, what got set up with that, or the woman who's walking on the very edge of the picture plane. So, or the little feet, the little feet, they, at first you may look at them and say, oh, I get that. They're not dense and crowded like my images are yet. I think a similarity is that more and more is gained the longer that you look.
It's almost like choreography or dance, particularly the way the gestures are moving and pointing.
I have a question, and maybe everybody has not had a chance. They came right in and sat down, but for you, Charlotte, the titles of your works are so elaborate, and I wonder if it takes you a long time, if you deliberate on the
are very important to me, I think, because there's so much ideas in the work that they don't explain the work, but they somehow offer keys or a core or like an adjunct. I spend, quite a bit of time looking at them. I refer to notes. I read, I underline, I put the notes in my sketchbook, I make little pictures of those things. Those are all part of the process that's not seen in the work, and I draw upon a lot of photographic references to make the images. But yeah, thank you.
So what are you reading now?
Well, I just finished a book called On Longing, Essays on the Miniature, the Gigantic, blah, blah, blah. I mean, one of the things I was going to mention, just about this notion about scale and the miniature doesn't attach itself to lived historical time. That scale kind of skews the relationship of the everyday world and kind of transforms it into an infinite time of reverie. It creates an other. Like this comes out of my sketchbook. So this is the kind of stuff that I get geeked up about. So in that, another book that Mernet also told me about is a book by Gilles Deleuze. It's called The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque. And it's very esoteric, but it just really triggered my imagination, and it was very influential in thinking about this malleability, mutability of space. I'm trying to think of other things. Maybe when I'm more relaxed, I will.
Well, I wanted to just make a comment in regards to something that you had said about how much time it takes and all that. And I think what Meg, she was alluding to was that, you're after a kind of timelessness and therefore, Mernet in particular, a kind of truth, I think. And there's irony in spending human time in doing that. How much human time does it take to get something somewhere timeless? And I think what, for me anyway, is really working is that you get us there, you get there in a way that feels like truth, but in a way we don't expect. You get us there in a way that we don't expect, and that maybe that's how you get to a certain timelessness, or an archaic moment of, that just feels right, that sense feels right. It's just there's that irony of timelessness, but it takes human time to work at it and get it, and then boom, it surprises us when you hit it. Or maybe you do.
Well, I mean, there's something to strive for sense of timelessness. I don't know if I achieved that. And I don't know how I would relate it, but it's interesting.
Hi, I was just curious where you find your inspiration. Like if you, either one of you, or both of you, like if you were looking to
Well, Charlotte did talk a little bit about 9/11 and things like that, but you have mentioned other things too, I know, in conversations together.
I mean, like if you are needing to be inspired, not specifically for that, but just for your heart and soul to be inspired, that then allows you to create your work. I wonder like what you look to do to get that inspiration.
I'll talk about a little broadly. I meditate, I work out, I read, my connections to my friends, good food, taking care of myself, all those things I would say could be just little moments in the world, possibly dreams, insights. I think in a way, it all you can draw from that. I mean, I talked about particularly the reading inspires me sometimes, other art, although earlier in graduate school I looked at a lot. I would say a little bit less so now. I mean, you just become very involved in your own work, and that has its own momentum.
Yeah, I think, well, for one sure I've gotten it yet. Know what I need to get things going, because it seems like it's always difficult to get into it, and to sustain it too. But I do look a lot at the books that I spent some time in Japan. My husband and I did in 1986, 6 weeks, and brought back a lot of material that I look at still and refer to, and it gets my imagination going. And some things from India and things from different cultural art, and especially early Renaissance art. So if I look at some of these early art, it gets some ideas going. And then there's a lot to be said for external pressure, which I discovered later in life. Because I was raised in the, artists who work from their souls and never work unless you feel a sense of inner necessity, and the market and selling work and all that stuff is really, a true artist doesn't ever think about any of those things. And it wasn't until I was in my 50s that I started to realize that some sort of external ambition, joining shows and things like that could actually be an ally rather than an enemy, and that it could push me over at times when I would probably have quit when I was in my 20s or 30s. Then I go ahead and push anyway because there's going to be this show, or there's, something is coming up that I have to have a celebration for. So I find that, do you find that to be also relevant?
Yeah. I feel that I know I have to be consistent because the work takes a long time. I'm just a little bit of a turtle. We're very different in our process. So I'm sort of a turtle. I just kind of plug along and I just do something. I keep like regular hours. I write them down. It kind of keeps me honest. It keeps me, maybe that's the external factor. That's it. I clock in my date book, and I clock out, even for lunch. And I add up my hours. I'm revealing things I've done. I add up my hours, and I go, oh, look at me. So sometimes when artists say that they worked in their studio for 8 or 10 hours, I'm slightly skeptical. It takes a lot of concentration when you're really focused, making decisions. It can be very enervating, draining, and after working 4 or 5 hours, you're done. It's enough. And you also, for me, I pace myself. I'm not interested in tapping into this running yourself into the ground. I'm interested in taking care of myself and sustaining my practice, until I'm very old and can't see.
I want to welcome everybody to speak with Mernet and Charlotte after we break up here, and I also want to invite you to take a look at all 4 shows. And again, with many thanks to our faculty and to all of the artists here tonight who participated in the poetry show in the hallway, and especially thanks to both of you. And it's truly an honor, and we're so lucky we're going to get to live with this work for a couple months. Thank you.